They buried her husband in the pouring rain, and before the last shovelful of dirt hit the coffin, his family cast her out. A young widow stood at the grave's edge, clutching her newborn to her chest, shawl plastered to her back like a second skin. Around her, the townsfolk lowered their hats, not in mourning, but in shameful silence, watching as her mother-in-law stepped forward to cut her loose like dead weight. The pine box vanished into the mud, and so did every claim Marianne had to a home, a name, a future. She walked away carrying only her child in a battered trunk, not knowing that someone was already waiting on the road ahead, reins in hand, eyes set on her fate. The sky over Dust Hollow pressed low and heavy, the color of hammered iron. Rain had fallen since dawn, soaking through coats and shawls, turning the churchyard into a mire where every step sank deep and pulled at boots like the earth itself wished to swallow the mourners. The scent of wet cedar from the bordering hills mixed with the sharp tang of freshly turned soil, rising from the open grave where a pine box was being lowered inch by inch on thick hemp ropes. Marianne stood unmoving, her frame fragile yet her gaze unbroken. In her arms, swaddled against the storm, lay her newborn son, his warm cheek pressed against the sodden wool of her dress. Around her, the Clark family offered no hand of comfort. At the far side stood Agatha Clark, tall and rigid, her black dress plastered to her frame, eyes like cold flint. When the preacher's words faded, Agatha's voice cut through the downpour. "From this moment you are no longer part of the Clark family. Take your things and leave this land." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but no one stepped forward. The foreman dragged a battered trunk to the mud and dropped it at Marianne's feet. The thud sent a splash across her skirt. Agatha's mouth curled thin. "That's all you brought into this family. It will do for wherever you end up." Marianne did not beg. She only bent her head to steady the baby's whimper, then lifted her chin again, pride unbroken. Turning from the grave, she walked away in silence. The rain thinned to mist as she reached the edge of town. Hoofbeats broke the hush, slow, steady. A lone rider emerged from the gray horizon, his bay gelding steady in the muck. He reined in before her, brim shadowing his eyes. He said nothing at first, only looked at her as though weighing something larger than pity. And in that moment, the road ahead no longer felt quite as empty. If you love tales of grit, redemption, and love that lasts, subscribe to Dust and Destiny now and ride with us to the very end. The muddy track stretched before her like a sentence with no end. Each step sucked at her boots, the battered trunk dragging heavy at her side. Marianne shifted the bundle in her arms, pressing her lips against the damp crown of her son's head. His warmth was the only thing that kept the chill from crawling straight into her bones. She refused to look back at the church, at the cluster of black umbrellas and bowed hats. They had turned their eyes away when she needed them most. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her falter. At the edge of town, the rain thinned into a cold drizzle, mist hanging low across the hills. That was when she heard it. Hoofbeats, steady and deliberate. Not the hurried clatter of a ranch hand, but the measured rhythm of a man who knew every mile of country under his horse. A rider emerged from the gray horizon, his bay gelding sure-footed in the slick mud. The man's shoulders were broad beneath a trail-worn coat, his hat pulled low, face angular from years under a relentless sun. He reined in, studying her with eyes steady and unreadable. "Mrs. Clark." His voice carried easily, low and rough, but not unkind. Marianne tightened her hold on the child. "You know my name," she said cautiously. "I rode with Thomas more than once," he replied, dismounting in one smooth motion. Boots sank into the mud with a soft thud. He was a good man. The mention of her husband's name pulled something sharp in her chest, but she kept her chin high. "Everyone seems to remember him today," she said, her voice thin but steady. The rider let the words sit in the rain. Then he nodded once. "Caleb Morgan." She recognized the name faintly. One of those who had worked the range with Thomas, a man whose family had lost their ranch to fever and drought years back. A man who had survived more storms than most. He glanced down at the trunk near her feet, then back to the baby swaddled against her chest. "Where are you headed?" he asked. Marianne swallowed. I don't know. Caleb studied her in silence, his expression revealing nothing, only the faint tightening of his jaw. It's too far to town in this weather. That boy's already cold. Her grip on the child tightened. We'll manage. I don't want charity. His brow lifted slightly. Charity is when someone gives because they feel sorry for you. His voice was calm, weighted. This isn't that. Then what is it? Honor, he said simply. Your husband had my back once when a gang thought their guns were the law. Seems right I stand for his family now. Marianne's lips pressed together. She had heard pity dressed in prettier words before, always with a price attached. But there was no flattery in Caleb's tone, no performance for the townsfolk who had already turned away. Only a plain statement, as steady as the rain falling around them. You don't know me, she said finally. I know enough. He bent and hefted the trunk in one hand, slinging it across his saddle as though it weighed no more than a sack of grain. Then he held out his free hand to her. My place is a few miles west. You can warm up there, decide what comes after once you've caught your breath. The drizzle clung cold to her hair, her dress heavy with mud. Her son whimpered, cheeks pink with chill. Every mile she imagined walking alone stretched wide and endless. Caleb Morgan stood as though time itself had slowed, patient, unwavering, offering nothing more than a choice. Marianne drew a long breath, the kind that scraped against her ribs, and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, steady, not the grasp of a man offering rescue, but of one honoring a debt that went deeper than words. She let him lift her into the saddle, the child secure against her chest. Caleb mounted behind, his coat blocking the wind as the gelding started westward at an easy lope. For the first time since morning, Marianne did not feel as if the ground were falling away beneath her feet. Instead, she felt the faintest promise that somewhere ahead there might still be solid earth to stand on. The gelding's hooves struck a steady rhythm on the sodden track, carrying them westward out of Dust Hollow. The rain had eased to a fine mist, clinging to Marianne's lashes, softening the edges of the world. She sat rigid in the saddle, the weight of her child pressed to her chest, while Caleb rode behind, one arm steady on the reins, the other braced loosely against the saddle horn. Between them hung a silence thick as fog, yet not empty. Each was measuring the other, waiting. The baby fussed, small cries swallowed by the damp air. Marianne rocked gently, murmuring under her breath. Caleb shifted his weight, his coat brushing lightly against her shoulder. He did not intrude, but she felt the steady warmth at her back, a barrier between her and the miles of emptiness that stretched ahead. Fields gave way to open range, miles of scrub grass bending under the drizzle. Fences leaned tired against the weather, and the air carried the faint scent of wet sage. Every sight pulled Marianne back, not to the Clark's land where she had never been welcome, but to the farm where she had first learned hardship. Her father's land had been 20 acres of rocky soil, barely enough to coax beans and corn from the earth. She remembered the summer the well had gone dry, the cracks splitting across the earth like a map of failure. Her father, shoulders stooped but voice unbroken, had kept saying, "We'll find a way." But the land never gave, and neighbors' pity was colder than the dust that settled over their fields. When Thomas Clark rode up one day, broad-shouldered and proud, offering marriage and a roof, she had thought it a mercy. What she did not know was that mercy would come at a cost she would pay in silence. The memory tightened her chest. She drew the child closer, as though shielding him from the ghosts that rode beside her. Behind her, Caleb cleared his throat, low. Thomas once pulled me out of trouble in Abilene, he said, voice roughened by distance more than shyness. Couple of men had decided my herd was theirs. No badge around, no law but iron. He stood beside me when no one else would. Marianne's head turned slightly, just enough to catch his profile beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes stayed on the horizon, not on her. He never spoke of that, she murmured. Wasn't his way, Caleb replied. But I haven't forgotten. For a while, the only sound was the creak of leather and the steady breath of the horse. Marianne thought of Thomas, proud, quick to temper, but never a coward. It was strange hearing another man's voice soften when speaking of him. Most of the Clarks remembered Thomas only as an heir who had married poorly. Caleb remembered a man who had stood his ground. The drizzle thinned as the hills rolled higher, their outlines sharpening against a pale sky. Marianne shifted in the saddle, and for the first time she allowed herself to glance back at Caleb. He carried himself like a man carved from the same stubborn earth he rode upon, shoulders set, jaw lined with both loss and endurance. Yet there was something in the quiet steadiness of him that unsettled her more than harsh words ever could. "You said you rode with him more than once," she said carefully. Caleb nodded. "On drives, on long nights when the fire was low. He spoke of you." Her breath caught. What did he say? Caleb's mouth tightened, as though weighing the weight of words already gone. That you had more grit in you than anyone gave you credit for. The world seemed to still. Marianne turned her face away quickly, blinking against the sting that rose unbidden. She had been so long unseen that the thought of her husband's quiet defense, carried now in Caleb's voice, cut sharper than any insult. The ranch finally appeared, a spread of low buildings nestled at the foot of the hills, smoke curling faint from a chimney. Fences framed pastures that stretched wide, the kind of land that could weather a storm and still stand tall in the morning. Caleb slowed the gelding, his gaze sweeping the familiar horizon. Marianne studied the place, its worn boards and rough-hewn beams. It was not grand, but it was steady, a word made into wood and stone. And in the tilt of Caleb's shoulders, in the careful way he looked at the land, she felt a truth slip beneath her skin. This was not charity, not pity. Something older bound him to this moment. Memory, loyalty, perhaps something he had not spoken. As Caleb swung down to help her from the saddle, his eyes caught hers, steady, knowing. And in that flicker, Marianne felt certain he remembered more of her than he admitted, as though her story had brushed his long before their paths had crossed this muddy road. Night fell early over the hills, drawing a sharp chill that clung to the rafters of Caleb's ranch house. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, filling the single-room cabin with warmth that the wind clawing at the shutters could not breach. Marianne sat in the straight-back chair, her son resting in the old cradle near the hearth. The quilt Caleb had dug from storage was tucked tight, and the baby's tiny fists opened and closed as he dreamed. The glow of the flames danced across the cradle's worn rails, making them shine as though the wood carried the warmth of another lifetime. Marianne's hands twisted in her lap. The storm had stripped her of everything familiar, and though the fire crackled steady, her chest felt knotted with words unsaid. She had spent years enduring silence at the Clark table. Every word she spoke turned aside, every kindness measured and withheld. To sit here now, with no accusing eyes on her, was almost unbearable. Caleb crouched near the hearth, adjusting a log until sparks flared. He didn't glance back at her. He had a way of giving space without making it feel like distance. His silence was not dismissal. It was an opening, if she dared take it. "You should know," Marianne said finally, her voice low, almost lost beneath the sigh of the wind against the eaves. "The Clarks never wanted me. Not the day Thomas brought me to their door, not the years I lived under their roof. To them, I was soil too poor to grow anything worth keeping. They let me stay because Thomas insisted, but I was never one of them." Caleb stirred the fire, the poker scraping softly. "And yet you stayed," he said, not as an accusation but as a plain fact. Marianne's throat tightened. "I thought patience would change them, that if I worked harder, if I held my tongue, if I bore their coldness with grace, they would see I was not a burden. But no matter what I did, they reminded me I was an outsider. When Thomas died, it was as if my presence had been tolerated only for his sake. The moment he was gone, so was my place." Her gaze dropped to the cradle, to the soft shape of her child breathing evenly in the firelight. "I carried shame like it was stitched into my skin for not being enough, for giving Thomas nothing they considered worthy, and now I stand here with nothing but this child, wondering if perhaps they were right all along." Caleb set the poker aside, the sound of iron against stone final, and leaned one forearm on his knee. His face was calm, firelight carving shadows along his jaw. He looked at her then, not blinking, not shifting away from the weight of her confession. "Standing tall in the mud takes more grit," he said quietly, "than any bullet I've ever fired." The words landed with a weight she could not deflect. He did not speak them like a man offering comfort, but like a man stating truth carved from his own marrow. Marianne drew a slow breath, the knot in her chest loosening by degrees. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt the shame she carried waver. Not vanish, but falter in the face of someone who did not measure her by what she had lost or by what others claimed she lacked. Silence settled again, but this time it was easier. The fire snapped, the baby sighed in his sleep, and the cabin held a quiet that was not heavy, but whole. Marianne let her shoulders rest against the chair back, warmth seeping into her bones. Caleb rose, moving with the sure economy of a man used to long days and little wasted effort. He hung his hat on the peg by the door, set his gloves neatly on the shelf. Every gesture was plain, yet each seemed to confirm what his words had already given: steadiness, not judgment. Marianne's gaze drifted once more to the cradle. The lamplight gilded the rails, catching the softened grooves worn by years long past. In its glow, she saw not just a vessel for her child, but a sign that this place remembered how to hold life safe. When she finally spoke again, her voice was quiet, but firm. "Thank you for giving us shelter." Caleb inclined his head. "You'll find I don't give anything I don't mean to stand by." The simple statement settled over her like the quilt across her son, heavy but sure. She did not call it love, not yet. But in that cabin, with the fire warming her skin and the cradle glowing steady by the hearth, Marianne felt the beginning of something else. A partnership, fragile but real, built not on pity but on recognition. The morning broke clear after a week of gray skies, sunlight spilling across the yard and turning the wet earth to a patchwork of gold and shadow. The ranch stirred with the rhythm of work. Caleb mending fence posts, a hired hand tending to the cattle in the lower pasture. But inside the cabin, the world had slowed to something gentler. Marianne paused in the doorway of the small workshop, her son resting against her shoulder. The air smelled of cedar shavings and lamp oil, of wood brought back to life beneath steady hands. Caleb stood at the workbench, sleeves rolled, shoulders squared, the rasp of his knife whispering across a smooth piece of pine. His brow was furrowed, but his movements were patient, deliberate. At first, she thought he was shaping a length of rail for the corral. Then she saw the curve, the familiar contour of an object long tucked away. The old cradle, its surface sanded clean, its joints tightened and mended. Each stroke of the blade revealed grain that glowed honey-rich in the shaft of light from the window. Caleb glanced up, eyes flicking briefly to hers before returning to the work. "Figured it was time it saw use again," he said. "My mother rocked all her children in this cradle. Been locked in storage since my sister passed. I reckon it's waited long enough." Marianne's throat tightened. She stepped closer, adjusting the baby's blanket as though steadying her own hands. The cradle was not new, not polished to perfection, but there was dignity in its worn rails, in the careful way Caleb was restoring what others might have left to rot. She watched as he set aside the knife and picked up a carving chisel. Bracing the cradle against the bench, he began to etch letters into the upper rail. Each line was slow, precise, deliberate. Shavings curled and fell to the floor like pale ribbon. She leaned forward, heart thudding as the name took shape. Ethan Morgan. The baby stirred, a soft whimper against her shoulder. Marianne pressed her lips to his temple, eyes stinging. "That name," she whispered, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "It isn't his by blood." Caleb set the chisel down, his palm brushing the fresh grooves. Then he turned, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "Blood doesn't make a man's name worthy, the way you live does." The words sank deep, steady as bedrock. For years, she had borne the weight of being told she was unworthy, that her presence tainted the Clark name. Here, in the glow of morning light and the scent of cedar shavings, she saw that weight crumble. The rejection that had defined her began to lose its grip. Marianne stepped forward, her son shifting against her arms. She lowered him gently into the cradle, the quilt settling around him. For a moment she held her breath, watching his tiny chest rise and fall against the carved name. He stirred once, sighed, and settled deeper into sleep as though the wood itself recognized him. Her hand lingered on the rail, fingertips tracing the grooves of the letters. "Ethan Morgan," she said softly, the sound unfamiliar, but right. She had carried shame like a brand, but here was proof that her child would grow under a name not marked by scorn, but by choice. Caleb stood beside her, quiet as the fire crackling in the next room. He didn't offer more words. He didn't need to. His presence was steady, his silence a shield rather than a void. Marianne straightened slowly, her shoulders lighter than they had been in years. The cradle glowed in the slant of sun, no longer a relic, but a promise. She turned to Caleb, her voice stronger than she expected. "You've given him more than a name. You've given him a place." Caleb's eyes softened, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. "And so have you." In that small room filled with wood shavings and sunlight, Marianne felt the wound of rejection begin to close. She had been cast out with nothing, told she had no worth. But here, she saw with her own eyes, worth was not something given by blood or taken by name. It was something claimed, carved into the wood grain of life itself, steady and enduring. The wind carried the scent of snow long before the first flake touched the high ridges. Caleb had been watching the sky for days, knowing the herd could not remain in the upper pasture once the passes closed. On the morning the clouds gathered thick and low, he saddled his bay gelding with swift, sure hands. "We moved them today," he told Marianne, tightening the cinch strap. She shifted the baby higher against her shoulder. "The trail is narrow this time of year. If the weather turns, it's the only way to bring them down before the snow buries the pass," Caleb cut in, his tone firm but not harsh. "I'll be back before nightfall." Marianne did not answer at once. Then, with that stubborn lift of her chin he had come to recognize, she set the baby into the arms of the ranch hand's wife and swung up into her saddle. "If you're driving them through the pass, I'm riding with you." He did not argue. He had learned there was no use when Marianne's mind was set like flint. By midday, they were winding along the narrow mountain trail, the herd crowding tight against the slope, hooves scattering loose rock into the ravine below. The sky pressed heavy, the air sharp enough to sting their throats. Caleb rode point, scanning the ridge. Marianne kept to the flank, calling low and steady when the cattle shifted too near the edge. Halfway up the climb, something caught her eye. A patch of soil scraped clean, unnaturally raw against the slope. Above it, a line of boulders rested too neatly, balanced in a way no mountain ever left them. Her stomach turned cold. "Caleb!" she shouted across the ball of the cattle. She pointed with her reins, voice cutting through the din. "That ridge! Look at the rocks!" He turned in the saddle, eyes narrowing. The glint of frayed rope half buried in dirt confirmed what she had seen. His jaw clenched. "Jed," he muttered. Even as the name left his mouth, a rifle crack split the air. The wedge anchoring the pile gave way. "Move!" Caleb bellowed. The mountainside erupted. Boulders sheared loose, crashing onto the trail in a thunder of stone on stone. Dust and splinters filled the air as cattle bawled in panic, hooves scrambling for purchase. Marianne wheeled her horse, arms out, shouting, waving, driving the herd away from the drop. Caleb spurred forward, his gelding lunging clear as a boulder smashed across the path behind him, showering shards. A second crack rang out, gunfire from the ridge. Ranch hands fired back, their pistols spitting dust up the slope. Caleb leaned low over his saddle, scanning the line above. He caught a glimpse of Jed Malone's dust coat as he pulled back from the ridge. "Keep them moving!" Caleb barked, wheeling his gelding to flank the herd. Marianne was already there, her face pale but her eyes steady. She whipped her reins against her horse's neck, voice sharp as she drove the panicked cattle toward the lower slope. Gunfire echoed, hot and hollow. A shot sang past Marianne's ear, close enough to lift her hair. She ducked, heart hammering, but did not break her rhythm. Caleb returned fire, his revolver steady in one hand while he guided his gelding with the other. Dust swirled, cattle bawled, the trail filled with chaos. At last, the herd broke onto wider ground, stumbling into the valley floor where the slope eased. The last of the rocks thundered harmlessly down, scattering dirt and smoke. Caleb reined in, chest heaving, scanning the ridge above. It was empty now, the echoes fading. Jed and his men had melted into the mountains as swiftly as they had come. Marianne slowed her horse beside him, sweat darkening the leather of her reins. Her face was streaked with dust, her hair loose, but her eyes were clear. "They'll be back," she said. Caleb holstered his revolver, gaze still fixed on the ridge. "Aye," he replied, "but not today." The herd milled restless in the valley, but alive. Not a single steer had gone over the edge. The ranch hands gathered, bruised and shaken, their faces pale beneath the grime. Every eye drifted to Marianne, who had spotted the danger before anyone else. "You saved them," Caleb said, his voice low, meant for her alone. She shook her head. "I only noticed what didn't fit." He turned toward her then, his gaze sharper than the wind whistling down the slope. "That's the difference between walking away alive and being buried under stone. Don't ever call it only." Marianne held his eyes a moment longer, then looked back at the herd, their flanks heaving with effort. She felt the ache in her arms, the sting of dust in her throat, and the strange, steady thrum of victory beneath it all. The mountains had nearly taken them, but they had held fast together, her, Caleb, the herd. It was not a final triumph, but it was a warning to the shadows that hunted them. This land, these lives, would not fall easily. As the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the clouds in bruised purple, Caleb let out a low whistle. The cattle began to settle, their bawling quieting into the rhythm of grazing. He looked once more at Marianne, his expression unreadable but sure. "This was just a taste," he said. "They'll try again." Marianne lifted her chin, dust streaking her face, and for the first time since leaving the Clark house, she did not feel like a woman merely surviving. She felt like someone who belonged to the fight. And though the battle was far from finished, they had won the day. The town hall of Dust Hollow brimmed with bodies and smoke, voices restless until the gavel cracked. Mayor Crenshaw leaned forward, his tone booming. "The Denver and Pacific's Railroad offers a fair price for Morgan's northern pastures. This town would prosper." Merchants cheered, already counting profits. A few ranchers nodded. Caleb Morgan, seated in the back, rose slowly, hat in hand. "And whose land will that track cut through?" Crenshaw's smile thinned. "Yours. It's more than generous." Caleb's voice cut through the chamber. "That section is my best winter pasture. Without it, my herd starves. My father fenced it. My mother drove cattle across it in storms that near broke her. And you'd sell it for a promise that'll change with the wind." "No." The room shifted uneasily. "You're one man standing in the way of progress," Crenshaw pressed. "And you're a room ready to sell your neighbor's grave for profit." Silence thickened, until the back door opened. Marianne stepped inside, her child swaddled in her arms. She walked without pause to stand behind Caleb, lifting her chin as the baby whimpered softly. She spoke no word, but the sight of her, banished widow turned resolute mother, stilled the whispers. Caleb's voice steadied, strengthened by her presence. "You wanted to see what this land means. You're looking at it. My name's on the deed, but it feeds more than cattle. It feeds a family, and that's worth more than your coin or your promises." The vote came. More hands for the railroad than against, but not enough to pass. The motion failed. Crenshaw slammed his gavel. "This isn't over." Caleb tipped his hat. "Neither am I." Together, he and Marianne walked out into the drizzle. For the first time, she did not feel like a guest in his shadow, but a partner, her child secure, her place beside him undeniable. Lanterns swung above Dust Hollow's main street, their glow spilling over stalls of roasted corn and cider. The harvest festival hummed with laughter, fiddles, and the sweet smoke of bonfires. Yet when Caleb Morgan stepped onto the small platform beside the gazebo, the music stilled and every eye turned. He held a folded parchment, its seal catching the lantern light. "You all know my land, my herd, and my name," he began, voice calm but steady. "But there's something you might not know, or perhaps tried not to see." His gaze found Marianne in the crowd, her son cradled close. "This is the deed to the Morgan Ranch," he said. "I've made some changes. Ethan Morgan, her boy, is heir to this land. From this night forward, no council, no company, no family will take that from him." A hush fell. Marianne's breath caught, tears burning hot as the child stirred against her. Then a single clap rose, joined by another, until the applause rolled through the square like thunder after drought. Faces that once turned away now softened, acceptance breaking like dawn across the crowd. Agatha Clark stood at the edge, rigid, her mouth a thin line. But she said nothing. She didn't need to. The defeat was plain in her eyes. Caleb stepped down and offered his hand. Marianne took it, their fingers steady as the land beneath their feet. Together they walked into the lantern-lit street, Ethan's name now carved not only in wood, but in the heart of a community. The past had not vanished, but here they chose how to carry it. Together with honor, grit, and love that endured. If stories like this stir your soul, subscribe now, share it with a friend, and tell us your thoughts in the comments.